So last week they wanted 0 restrictions on bringing in military stuff after an armistice. And now they want 100% total restriction on bringing in military stuff after an armistice. Yeah, I got nothing. All right. Yeah, see ya. December 9th, 1951. Inspections and rebuilding post-armistice. That's what's on the menu this week at the Panmunjom peace talks. And guess what? One side wants none of the former, and the other side wants none of the latter. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week came a seeming breakthrough in the peace talks when a demarcation line based on current line of contact was agreed upon as an armistice line, provided the rest of the talks agenda is completed within 30 days. But there's still big issues, particularly things like the right of inspection should there be an armistice, the right to rotate and replenish troops, and rebuilding of infrastructure. In case you hadn't figured it out from last week, once the demarcation line issue was settled, the UN's goal was to prevent the communists from rebuilding their army and renewing the assault on the South. Hence, an insistence on inspection and a ban on the increase of military forces and equipment in either half of the country. On December 3rd, the communists make a concession. The 5 points they issued last week, which the UN side said were okay but incomplete, are now expanded with 2 more. This is what they say. 6. In order to ensure the stability of the military armistice, so as to facilitate the holding by both sides of a political conference of a higher level, both sides shall undertake not to introduce into Korea any military force, weapons, and ammunition under any pretext. 7. In order to supervise the strict implementation of the stipulation of paragraph 6, both sides agree to invite representatives of nations neutral in the Korean War to form a supervisory organ to be responsible for conducting necessary inspection beyond the demilitarized zone of such ports of entry in the rear as mutually agreed upon by both sides, and to report to the Joint Armistice Commission the results of inspection. This throws the UN side for a loop. They most certainly are not prepared for such a drastic reduction of military stuff, nor for introducing neutral nations into the mix concerning inspections. Side note here, both sides have referred to neutral nations throughout the talks, and it's a pretty loose term. Generally, what they mean here is nations that don't have military forces in Korea, not actual declared neutral nations. They might very well not agree on whom is neutral. I'm pretty certain the US would not recognize the USSR as neutral in this conflict, nor would the Communist Chinese recognize Nationalist China as neutral. Anyhow, they take a short break, then the UN side asks a few questions for clarity, and then they decide that item 3 on the agenda, which this is about, which is concrete arrangements for the realization of ceasefire and armistice in Korea, including the composition, authority, and functions of a supervising organization for carrying out the terms of a ceasefire and armistice, once again, is to now be given to a sub-delegation to work out some sort of solution that works for everyone. This will also give the UN side time to get some instructions from Washington, D.C. because of these 2 new points. The communists accept the sub-delegation proposal, the 4th, and choose Generals Lee and Shih to be their representatives on it. Generals Turner and Hose are chosen for the UN side. When the sub-delegation met that afternoon, Lee soon made it clear there would be no rotation of personnel or replenishment of equipment under the communist plan, and that his side would brook no interference with the reconstruction of facilities in North Korea. The latter was a purely internal matter, and inspection was out of the question. Lee also says they're not really sure how the neutral nations group is going to be organized yet. Maybe 3, maybe 5 nations from each side. The concept is still under development, though he does say the group will operate independently from previously agreed upon points of entry. Oh, and the Military Armistice Commission will have authority and performance duties only in the DMZ. UN Chief Delegate Turner Joy is cautiously optimistic about the neutral nations thing and figures maybe they can work out a deal in that respect. he does not think the other side will keep many or any of its promises, which means they'd probably find some sort of way to avoid proper inspections behind the lines. So the neutral nations thing might actually be the answer. However, until he hears from Washington, all he does is delay the proceedings, asking question after question and offering critiques of the communist proposal. He also wants to submit a UN counterproposal so his side can regain the initiative. One that would insist upon rotation and replenishment, but would create a neutral nations organization in place of the Military Armistice Commission, would drop the claims of the UN command to retain coastal islands north of the demarcation line after the armistice, and also would cease to demand restrictions against rehabilitating airfields, only against constructing new airfields. In his opinion, this would give the UN command all that it required and be very hard for the communists to refuse. However, he really wants to take some sort of a stand as soon as possible to preempt criticism in the global press. On the 7th, he presses the Joint Chiefs to at the very least announce things on which the UN side will not concede. Joy thinks a big one of those should be the idea of neutral nations inspection teams not being under the Military Armistice Commission. Big side note here, UN Forces Commander Matt Ridgway is against the entire neutral nations proposal. He thinks it would inject loads of political stuff into what should be a solely military armistice, which would be in place until a permanent peace settlement. So, while waiting to hear from the Joint Chiefs and all, the sub-delegation keeps killing time. There are 2 new officers on the UN side, Claude Ferenbaugh and Ruth Van Libbe, but the discussions are unnecessarily vague. Thing is, the Joint Chiefs are not sitting around or killing time, but they have to coordinate with the State Department, which takes time in and of itself. And the US is also having military discussions with the British just now, and that too takes time. But by the 7th, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, after consulting Secretary of State Dean Acheson and retired Secretary of Defense George Marshall, have come up with something that just needs President Harry Truman's approval. Pointing out that there were 4 main issues at stake on item 3. They told the president there could be no shift in the UN stand on rotation and replenishment, since these were essential. Some concessions could be made in permitting the rehabilitation of facilities, but any decision relating to airfields under this concession would have to be referred to Washington if it became the last obstacle to an armistice. The Joint Chiefs do say, though, that the UN would agree to withdraw from coastal islands north of the demarcation line and to using neutral observers. They are pretty adamant, though, that those observers must be agreed upon by both sides and must be under the supervision of the Military Armistice Commission. So what does Truman think of this? He's not a big fan of allowing the enemy to rebuild all the roads, railroads, and other infrastructure that they've spent a lot of time and money bombing the crap out of. But the Joint Chiefs say a lot of people, especially at state, feel an armistice might be the only agreement reached about Korea for maybe a long time, maybe years. And if that's the case, it will not be possible to prevent rehabilitation and rebuilding. Anyhow, the U.S. plans to do reconstruction and rehabilitation in South Korea. So they don't want to take that off the table. I imagine we'll see if Truman approves or not next week. Truman is enjoying the warmth of a vacation in Key West, Florida. But winter has arrived in Korea, and it is cold with a capital cold. Last winter was the first one of the war, and it caused all kinds of hell for the men fighting the war on both sides. Remember, the UN forces drove up to the Yalu River, then the Chinese flooded the Korean peninsula and forced the UN way back southward. This not only played havoc with UN supply lines, it really hurt the distribution system, so a bunch of units had a real shortage of winter clothing and equipment. It is now a year later, and the war is in a very static phase, so they've got a pretty good handle on things in terms of supply. On the surface, the winter cold seems easier to deal with for the UN side, since the ground troops are mainly on the south slopes of hills, which are more often snow-free and which get more direct sun. The communist side gets more shadows, and in the rear areas, the UN housing is way more comfortable than that of the other side. Offsetting these advantages, however, was the enemy ability to overcome the rigors imposed by weather and terrain. The communist soldiers, many of whom were already acclimated to the weather of North Korea and North China, had borne the harsh winter of 1950-51 with less physical distress than the UN command. Under trying conditions, they had managed to live off the land and to fight vigorously on rations that would barely have provided subsistence for the majority of US troops. You also got to figure, just because you have winter equipment and clothes doesn't mean you really know how to use them, especially if you haven't had a lot of military training and come from a warm climate. You might have warm insulated boots, but if you don't have pairs of dry socks as well, and don't change socks fairly often, it's not going to help that much in the freezing Korean mountains. There is a big fear of frostbite among the UN forces, and that goes hand in hand with not knowing all that well how to prevent it. Many of the frontline shelters and the bunkers have not been winter-proofed to any great extent either, because people just don't know how to do it. Even digging shelters is a big issue by now. The ground is frozen, so normal entrenching tools break. You can use shovels and picks, sure, then you have to carry shovels and picks around. One infantry unit has the ingenuity to issue TNT to the men in like 900-gram blocks to break through the frozen top layer of ground. Ground maneuvers by now in the biting cold are mainly half-hearted. Now, before November 27th, when they set the demarcation line, there were at least minor engagements to try and get better positions. And 8th Army sent out patrols and raids in the daytime, and the Communists sent out patrols and raids at night. The one actual fight the past 3 weeks was November 17th and 18th, when ROK, South Korean, 6th Division advanced 3 kilometers east of Kumsong against the Chinese. But nothing like this is happening in December 1951. There are patrols, mainly at platoon and company level. Once in a while, battalion, but that's it. But the Chinese have been doing something interesting lately. Remember a few months ago, I talked about them shifting from their very much fluid fighting style to fixed positional warfare. The static conditions in the field this month have allowed them to finish the transition. And both the Chinese and North Koreans are digging in pretty well. And they've built a real defense in-depth system with both communications and supply trenches up to 2 meters deep. As they did over the summer, they build all gun emplacements and shelters to withstand pretty much anything short of a direct artillery hit. Using sand, logs, rocks, anything at hand is the construction material for serious overhead cover. In the actual trenches, every 5 or 6 meters is a little one-man shelter dug into the wall. Trenches lead up to the front machine gun and rifle positions and back to the rear kitchens and ammo dumps. These trenches are not limited to surface trenches either, since they've burrowed under hills to make more, leading to big underground bunkers. This recent buildup is not being much disturbed by the UN forces. It's not because the 30-day time limit after the line of demarcation was chosen meant a suspension of hostilities, but self-imposed restrictions, as both an act of good faith and because of winter, mean nobody wants to go out and see what the enemy is up to. Well, on the ground, that is, because in the skies, ever more communist planes are spotted daily, more than 300 on the 5th alone. And with that possible foreshadowing, I shall end this week of the war. A week of freezing in shelters on the front lines, and yet another week of back and forth at Panmunjom. Oh, and this week, the U.S. Department of Defense calls for a January draft of 55,000 men. You gotta wonder how the rebuilding and rehabilitation of facilities issue is going to go. There is no way around it. Korea is in ruins. North more than south, sure, but the south has been wrecked pretty badly too. And should an armistice be reached, but should it, as feared, be the only agreement for a long time? Is anyone really willing to just let all of Korea remain a blasted war zone with minimum infrastructure, just so the other side doesn't get to build up in case hostilities break out again? Of course, we know who gets it in the shorts once again: the Koreans. They always get the short end of the stick. The war may be a necessary war in the grand strategies of both sides, which includes the Korean armies, but try telling a Korean civilian why it's necessary that he not have usable roads. That's modern war. I wonder how this will all turn out. Who will give in? Who will get what they want? I'll be here to cover this war, active and static phases, until that all happens. It is thanks to the Time Ghost Army that I can bring to you often overlooked parts of our history. And for ever more of this, join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.com or Timegoes.tv, excuse me, or patreon.com. These are the newest commissioned Army officers, and Joshua Something, Mr. and Mrs. Something, named him Joshua apparently. Joshua Something is the Army Member of the Week for this channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.